All right, let's get right into it. We're about to unpack one of the most consequential disasters in the history of aviation. It's a story about a deadly design flaw, a shocking warning that was completely ignored, and the 346 people who paid the ultimate price for it. This is the story of Turkish Airlines Flight 981. Can you imagine hearing that? Those were some of the last frantic words that came from the cockpit. On March 3rd, 1974, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 was climbing out of Paris when all of a sudden something went catastrophically wrong. The sheer confusion and terror in the crew's voices came right over the radio, a truly chilling record of just how fast it all happened. 346 people, passengers and crew. Now, to put that in perspective, at the time, this was the deadliest single plane crash in history. Every single person on that flight was lost when the aircraft slammed into the Ermenonville Forest, just outside of Paris. The impact was just unsurvivable. The plane basically disintegrated, hitting the ground at almost 800 kilometers an hour. And this, right here, is the central mystery we're going to unravel. From the moment that cargo door blew off to the final impact, a grand total of 77 seconds passed. That's it. In just over a minute, this state-of-the-art airliner became an uncontrollable projectile. So what on earth could cause such a total, instantaneous loss of control? You know, the most staggering part of this whole tragedy, the part that's just infuriating, is that it wasn't a surprise. Not really. This exact same failure had happened before. The aviation world had been given a clear, unmistakable warning. Just look at this. The sequence of events was nearly identical. Less than 2 years before the Paris crash, American Airlines Flight 96 experienced the exact same failure. Its rear cargo door blew clean off mid-flight. The cabin floor buckled, it severed some of the control cables, but, and this is incredible, through sheer skill and a bit of luck, that crew managed to land the plane. Everyone survived. So the flaw was known. The consequences were crystal clear. So let's dig into the nuts and bolts of this thing. The problem wasn't some random component failing. It was literally engineered into the DC-10's design. And it all came down to one thing, its cargo door. Now, to cram in as much cargo as possible, the designers made the door open outwards. But this created a huge problem. See, at altitude, the cabin is pressurized, which means there are literally tons of force pushing outwards on that door, trying to blow it open. So the locking system had to be absolutely, positively, 100% foolproof. And here's the clever way it was supposed to work. When it was closed correctly, like you see in Figure 1, the latches went over center. It's a neat bit of physics, really. It meant that the air pressure pushing on the door actually made the lock stronger. But if it wasn't fully closed, like in Figure 2, those latches weren't properly engaged. They were just barely hanging on, fighting against all that incredible pressure. And here was the killer. The critical design flaw was that the little metal rod connecting the handle to the locking pins, well, it was just too weak. A baggage handler could force the handle shut, literally bending that linkage, even if the pins weren't fully locked. To everyone, it looked locked. A warning light in the cockpit would even go out. But that door, it was a ticking time bomb. Okay, so a technical flaw is one thing. But what happened next, that's where this turns into a cascade of human and systemic failures. Investigators knew exactly what was wrong after that first incident with American Airlines. The fix was known, but it was never, ever made mandatory. Right after that first incident, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board had some pretty harsh words and demanded changes. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, even started drafting what's called an airworthiness directive. Now, this is the big one. It's the big hammer. A legally binding order that would have grounded every single DC-10 until those doors were fixed for good. But that order never saw the light of day. Grounding the fleet would have been a financial and public relations nightmare for the manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas. So to avoid all that damage, the head of the FAA and a top executive at the company basically shook hands on a gentleman's agreement to handle the fix, quietly, without the legal force of a directive. So instead of a legally binding command, the fix was downgraded to something called a service bulletin. And that's basically just a strong suggestion. It's a recommendation, not an order. It gives airlines a lot of leeway on when and how to do the fix, and in doing so, it created a massive, deadly hole in the safety net. The bulletins recommended 3 key fixes. The most important was a simple support plate to keep that handle linkage from bending. They also added a tiny little window so you could physically see if the pins were locked. But here's the bombshell from the investigation. The plane that crashed, Flight 981, never had that critical support plate installed, even though the maintenance paperwork said it did. And that brings us to the final tragic domino in this chain. At the airport in Paris, the baggage handler who closed the door was an Algerian immigrant who only spoke French. He couldn't read the warning sign on the door because it was only in English and Turkish. He had no idea what that little viewing window was for. So when the handle felt stiff, he just did what anyone would do. He gave it some muscle and forced it shut, unknowingly setting the timer on that bomb. In the aftermath of this horrifying disaster, the aviation industry was forced to take a long, hard look in the mirror, and the changes that came from it have, without a doubt, made flying safer for all of us today. The French-led investigation was incredibly quick and absolutely definitive. The cause was exactly what everyone had feared after the first incident: the horribly designed cargo door and the complete failure to mandate the simple, life-saving fixes. There was zero ambiguity. This tragedy led directly to sweeping safety reforms. The DC-10 latching system was completely redesigned, for starters. New rules came in to prevent a plane's floor from collapsing during a decompression. But the crash also exposed something much deeper. The Applegate memo came to light, an internal document from 1970, a full 2 years before the first near miss, where an engineer explicitly warned McDonnell Douglas that the door design was dangerous and predicted this exact kind of failure. That revelation helped spark a total overhaul of how the FAA oversees aircraft manufacturers. The story of Flight 981 is just a brutal lesson in accountability, and it forces us to ask a tough question that's still really relevant today. In a system driven by profits and public relations, when a company is warned about a fatal flaw but isn't legally forced to fix it, who's really responsible for the human cost of that failure?